Step into Victorian Britain and you'll immediately notice two things: a lot of smoke and a lot of people. The Industrial Revolution had turned big cities into magnets for opportunity, or at least something vaguely resembling it. Factories sprouted like mushrooms after rain, except these mushrooms belched coal smoke and consumed workers by the dozen. The population exploded. London alone doubled from about 1.5 million in 1800 to over 3 million by mid-century. By 1900 it had ballooned past 6 million. That's not growth, it's urban overpopulation on steroids. The good news? You found a cheap room. The bad news? So did 20 other people. 3 rats and a suspicious puddle that's been here longer than the landlord. Privacy was a luxury, ventilation was a rumor, and indoor plumbing usually meant an overflowing bucket behind a curtain. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic why public health in the Victorian era was a complete disaster, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. These swelling cities were built for money-making, not for living. The skyline bristled with smokestacks, while the ground-level reality was a patchwork of hastily built housing, back-alley lodging houses, and so-called courts that were less cozy courtyards and more death traps. Streets weren't neatly planned. They were crammed together with the logic of a toddler stacking blocks. Want sunlight? Too bad. Want fresh air? Congratulations. You've just inhaled soot, dust, and whatever mysterious particles your neighbor coughed out the window this morning. Factories offered jobs, but they also offered the delightful gift of environmental collapse. Coal smoke mixed with damp air to create a perpetual haze, so thick that contemporary visitors described cities as a region of perpetual twilight. Imagine living in a world where you wake up at noon, squint outside, and can't tell if it's morning fog or the Industrial Revolution strangling the horizon. Spoiler, it's the latter. And where people gathered, problems multiplied. The lack of infrastructure couldn't keep pace with the human tide pouring into cities. Roads were poorly maintained. Pavements, if they existed, were narrow and clogged, and lighting at night was so inadequate that walking home after dark felt like starring in your own Jack the Ripper audition. Fire hazards were everywhere, so were the rats, and while cats theoretically could have helped, they were too busy hunting each other in alleyway showdowns. The slums became infamous. In Manchester's industrial districts, families squeezed into single-room cellars, sometimes 6 or more crammed into a space barely large enough for a bed. In London's East End, entire streets were lined with lodging houses where the poor could rent a bed by the night, or, if you couldn't afford that, half a bed to share with a stranger. For the truly destitute, there was the penny sit-up, a rope strung across a room where you paid 1 penny to sit on a bench, slumped forward and sleeping against the rope. Forget memory foam. Victorians were perfecting the art of budget back pain. This rapid urban growth didn't just make life uncomfortable, it made it actively dangerous. Without effective urban planning, open spaces shrank, drainage was almost non-existent, and garbage disposal usually meant tossing refuse into the nearest street or river. The streets themselves became obstacle courses of mud, manure, and discarded household waste. If you were lucky, the mud reached only your ankles. If you were unlucky, it swallowed your boots whole. One observer remarked that London streets contained a perpetual tide of filth. A less polite description would be nature's slip and slide, but with extra bacteria. Living in these cities also meant living with noise. The constant clatter of carriages, factory machines, and street vendors shouting out their wares made Victorian cities feel alive, but also relentless. Vendors hawked everything from oysters to roasted chestnuts, their cries competing with the shrill whistles of trains and the rhythmic pounding of textile mills. Rest was rare. The city's soundtrack was equal parts commerce and chaos, with a faint background melody of someone coughing their lungs out. And let's not forget the smells. Ah yes, the Victorian perfume, a delightful medley of coal smoke, horse manure, human waste, rotting food, and stagnant water. Each city corner was a different note in this aromatic symphony, and none of them were good. Travel writers often described London as both magnificent and revolting, a palace built over a cesspit, as one put it. If you think modern cities smell bad on garbage day, imagine every day as garbage day, plus a side of dead horse left to rot in the gutter. But despite all this, people kept coming. Why? Because as grim as the cities were, they promised work. The countryside offered back-breaking farm labour and very little cash. Factories, for all their dangers, at least dangled the possibility of a steady wage, if you could avoid losing a finger in the machines. For many, the gamble was worth it. Life expectancy might be short, but hunger was even shorter. So here's the reality check. The Victorian city was a paradox. It was a place of innovation, invention, and cultural growth, but also a place where just existing was a health hazard. Every breath carried coal dust, every sip of water carried suspicion, and every footstep risked ankle-deep filth. To be a Victorian urban dweller was to participate in a grand, unintentional experiment in how much misery a human body could withstand while still getting up for work at 6 a.m. The Victorian city wasn't just alive, it was alive, overcrowded, smelly, noisy, and actively trying to kill you. London. 8. The city is booming. The empire is flexing its muscles, and Queen Victoria is firmly on the throne. But beneath the grandeur, London had a serious problem. Literally beneath. Its sewage system was less system and more wishful thinking. The Thames, that mighty river which poets had praised for centuries, had been transformed into the capital's largest toilet bowl. And in the summer of 1858, it finally decided to fight back. For centuries, London had relied on cesspits, pits dug beneath or behind houses where waste was dumped, occasionally covered over, and ideally emptied when full. But ideally is the operative word here. With a population now numbering in the millions, these cesspits overflowed faster than anyone could empty them. When it rained, liquid filth seeped into basements, streets, and if you were especially unlucky, your drinking water. But by the mid-19th century, cesspits weren't even the final destination. Instead, raw sewage flowed directly into the Thames through thousands of drains, flushing the capital's waste into its own water supply. Londoners joked darkly that the Thames had become the city's silent highway. It carried away waste, yes, but it also carried away hope for clean living. Newspapers described it as a river of brown sludge, frothing with the runoff of human waste, industrial chemicals and animal carcasses. Standing too close to the water on a warm day was a sensory experience nobody wanted. Your nose burned, your stomach turned, and your appetite vanished. One journalist wrote that the Thames had become a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable horrors. Translation: it stank to high heaven. The summer of 1858 was especially hot, which made the situation unbearable. The sun baked the river's stew of waste until London itself seemed wrapped in a foul-smelling blanket. The stench didn't just linger near the river. It rolled across the city in waves, seeping into homes, shops and government buildings. Parliament, located right on the riverbank, was hit hardest. MPs tried everything: lime, chloride of lime, carbolic acid to mask the odour. They even soaked curtains in vinegar, hoping the sharp scent would drown out the sewage. Imagine your city smelling so bad that Parliament had to soak curtains in vinegar just to keep working. That's not politics, that's survival. The Great Stink wasn't just unpleasant, it was terrifying. Londoners had long believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease was spread by bad smells or foul airs. If you caught a whiff of the Thames in 1858, you didn't just wrinkle your nose, you panicked that you'd inhaled death itself. People blamed the odour for cholera outbreaks, typhoid, and a dozen other afflictions. To live in London that summer was to live in constant dread, with your own nose acting as a warning siren. The government could no longer ignore the problem. For decades, reformers had begged for a modern sewage system, but politicians balked at the cost. After all, it wasn't glamorous to spend millions on underground pipes nobody would see. But now, with the stench wafting directly into their debating chamber, the problem was personal. If Victorian London was drowning in filth, the Great Stink was the shove that finally made the powerful reach for their wallets. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, civil engineer and eventual hero of clean living. His solution was as ambitious as it was necessary: build a massive system of underground sewers to intercept waste before it reached the Thames. Over 1,300 miles of street sewers were linked to 82 miles of main intercepting sewers, designed to carry waste eastwards, away from central London, before dumping it further downriver. And these weren't just dinky pipes. Some were large enough to walk through. Brick-vaulted tunnels that represented some of the most impressive engineering of the 19th century. Bazalgette had the foresight to build the pipes far larger than seemed necessary at the time. When asked why, he explained that if London kept growing, the system would need to keep up. In other words, he thought ahead, and that foresight means parts of Bazalgette's sewer system are still in use today. Talk about a legacy. Most Victorian politicians are remembered for scandals or speeches. Bazalgette is remembered for saving a city from drowning in its own muck. The Great Stink also transformed how Londoners thought about public health. Before 1858, sanitation had been a matter for the poor to suffer through. The wealthy could retreat behind closed doors, assuming distance equaled safety. But the stink didn't respect class lines. When the smell invaded Parliament and aristocratic mansions along the river, the upper crust finally realized that disease and filth were democratic. They came for everyone. It was, in its own disgusting way, a unifying force. The press had a field day. Satirical cartoons showed Londoners gagging at the riverside, while political caricatures depicted MPs holding handkerchiefs to their noses. Pamphlets warned of apocalyptic outcomes if nothing was done. The Times thundered that the Thames had become a great Stygian sewer and predicted disaster if London failed to act. Rarely had such pungent persuasion spurred Parliament into action so quickly. And so, out of the Great Stink came one of the greatest infrastructure projects of the Victorian age. Bazalgette's sewers didn't just tame the Thames, they transformed London from one of the smelliest cities in the world into a model of urban sanitation. And while people at the time might not have fully grasped the role of germs, they could at least appreciate the simple joy of opening a window in summer without immediately regretting it. The Great Stink was an olfactory nightmare, but it forced a city to confront its own filth. It turned disgust into progress, gagging into government action. It was proof that sometimes, to get people moving, all it takes is a smell so bad that vinegar-soaked curtains become official policy. If you lived in Victorian London, the act of drinking water was less a refreshing choice and more a high-stakes gamble. Clean, sparkling water? Forget it. Your options were murky, possibly lethal, or slightly murkier, definitely lethal. And if you wanted to survive, you might as well start developing a taste for gin, since at least alcohol killed some of the germs your water helpfully carried straight into your stomach. The 19th century saw repeated waves of cholera sweep through Britain, and the disease was as terrifying as it was swift. Imagine waking up feeling fine, and by evening you're doubled over with vomiting, cramps, and the kind of diarrhea that emptied your body faster than a factory whistle emptied the streets. The mortality rate was staggering. Sometimes more than half of those infected died, often within hours. Cholera wasn't just deadly, it was dramatic. It turned strong men into lifeless husks overnight. No wonder Victorians were terrified of it. The problem was, they didn't actually understand what caused it. The prevailing theory of the time was miasma, the belief that disease spread through foul-smelling air. If something reeked, it must be dangerous. So while cholera was being spread through contaminated drinking water, most Victorians thought they just needed to avoid bad smells, which meant they were blaming the stench, not the sewage they were literally sipping. If you were unlucky enough to live near a cesspit or a water source downstream from someone else's waste, you weren't just drinking water, you were participating in what we might generously call the communal digestion cycle. Enter Dr. John Snow, a man whose name would become legendary in the world of public health. Snow wasn't buying the miasma theory. He suspected cholera was waterborne. In 1854, during a particularly nasty outbreak in London's Soho district, he decided to put his theory to the test. Rather than plugging his nose and fleeing the smell, Snow did something radical. He mapped cases of cholera. Each death was a dot, and soon enough the dots clustered around one source, the Broad Street water pump. Snow's detective work was revolutionary. He showed that nearly all the cholera victims had drawn their drinking water from that pump. Those who hadn't, like workers at a nearby brewery who preferred beer, remained healthy. Imagine that, beer saving lives, not just Fridays. Snow presented his findings to local officials, and in a move that would later be celebrated as one of the great triumphs of epidemiology, he convinced them to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump. The outbreak slowed. A simple act disabling one pump helped prove that cholera wasn't floating through the air like a ghostly vapor, but swimming in the water people drank. And yet his theory wasn't universally accepted. The problem with being right too early is that everyone thinks you're crazy. Many doctors and politicians clung stubbornly to miasma theory. After all, the smell was undeniable, and scientific evidence was still murky. Germ theory was in its infancy, and people were reluctant to abandon the comforting logic that bad smells equaled bad health. Snow's careful data collection was groundbreaking, but without microscopes showing tiny microbes in action, skeptics dismissed his work. It would take decades before the wider medical community caught up. In the meantime, cholera kept returning. London endured multiple outbreaks throughout the mid-19th century, each leaving thousands dead. Entire families could be wiped out in a matter of days. Newspapers printed terrifying accounts of sudden deaths, fueling public fear. Streets were quieter during outbreaks, not because people avoided each other, but because so many were bedridden or gone. Cholera didn't discriminate. It killed rich and poor alike, though naturally the poor suffered more. Their water came from shared pumps and contaminated wells, while the wealthy sometimes had private supplies. Still, wealth wasn't a guarantee of safety. If your fancy mansion's water pipes were connected to the same polluted river, your social status didn't impress the bacteria. Cholera was ruthlessly egalitarian. The irony, of course, was that solutions were already emerging. Filtering water, boiling it, and separating sewage from drinking supplies were all simple, effective methods. But change came slowly. Infrastructure took time and money, and until the government was forced to act, most Londoners were left to fend for themselves. Advice ranged from the vaguely helpful boil your water to the absurd burn tar in your house to ward off the miasma. Spoiler, burning tar indoors only gave you a new set of problems. John Snow didn't live long enough to see his theories fully vindicated. He died in 1858, the same year as the Great Stink, just as his ideas were starting to gain traction. But his Broad Street map became iconic, a model for how data could solve medical mysteries. Today he's remembered as one of the fathers of modern epidemiology, the man who proved that sometimes the problem isn't in the air, it's in the cup you're drinking from. The lesson of cholera in Victorian London was painfully clear. Your health depended on something as basic as where your water came from. And in a city that treated rivers and wells like convenient trash bins, every sip was a gamble. The tragedy was that people didn't realize it until thousands had already died. So the next time you pour yourself a clean glass of water, take a moment to thank Dr. Snow. He saved more lives with one broken pump handle than most generals did with entire armies. Victorians thought they were inhaling death through their noses, but in reality they were swallowing it whole. When you think of Victorian London, one image probably comes to mind: a murky, gaslit street where shadowy figures disappear into the mist. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? Like the perfect backdrop for Sherlock Holmes solving a mystery, or Jack the Ripper lurking in the shadows. But here's the reality check. That mist wasn't just fog. It was a lethal cocktail of soot, smoke, sulfur, and damp air. In other words, the air itself was trying to kill you. Victorian Londoners didn't need horror stories. They just stepped outside and inhaled the Industrial Revolution straight into their lungs. The problem came from coal. Coal powered the factories, fueled the trains, heated the homes, and lit the streets. Londoners burned so much of the stuff that the sky often looked bruised, a permanent shade of grey. The smoke rose from 1,000 chimneys, only to get trapped by the city's damp climate. Add in London's natural fog, thick, heavy, and reluctant to leave, and you had the recipe for London particular. The nickname given to the dense yellow-brown smog that blanketed the city. It was so distinct that even Charles Dickens wrote about it, describing the city as wrapped in a dense fog of smoke and mist. But this wasn't just an aesthetic inconvenience. The smog was deadly. When coal smoke mixed with the natural fog, it created an acidic haze rich in sulfur dioxide and soot. Breathing it in irritated lungs triggered asthma and weakened immune systems. Respiratory illnesses skyrocketed and hospitals filled with patients hacking and wheezing like they'd swallowed a chimney. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. A particularly bad fog could kill thousands within days. Imagine stepping outside in the morning and being unable to see more than a few feet ahead. Street lamps glowed dimly through the haze, casting an eerie yellow glow. Carriages crawled along the streets, drivers straining to make out the shapes ahead. People stumbled into walls, into each other, or occasionally into the river. Getting lost was easy, but breathing was harder. One eyewitness described the smog as so thick that you could not see your hand before you. Another said it felt like inhaling wool. And the smell, oh the smell. The air carried the tang of sulfur and soot, a sharp sting that clung to your clothes and burned your nostrils. It wasn't just a fog you walked through. It followed you home, settled in your curtains, and lingered in your lungs long after you shut the door. People joked that London's fog was an entity of its own, alive and malevolent, creeping through keyholes and under doorframes like a villain in a penny dreadful. Except the joke usually ended with someone coughing up black phlegm. Victorian writers loved to describe the atmosphere. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray opens with the dim roar of London, muffled and subdued by fog. Arthur Conan Doyle had Sherlock Holmes solve crimes in a haze so thick it practically acted as camouflage. Fog became part of the city's identity, a moody backdrop for art and fiction. But for everyday Londoners, it wasn't charming. It was suffocating. The smog didn't just hurt people. It disrupted daily life. Factories sometimes shut down because workers couldn't see their machines. Traffic slowed to a crawl. In extreme cases, businesses closed, schools sent children home, and theatres cancelled performances because audiences couldn't see the stage. Imagine paying for opera tickets only to find the fog gave you an audio-only experience. Victorian life often depended on coal, but coal smoke had a nasty habit of shutting everything down. The worst fogs didn't just happen in winter, they could strike year-round. Though cold months were particularly brutal because every household fire added to the problem. Reports of accidents filled the newspapers, people falling off bridges, colliding with carriages, or wandering into canals because they couldn't see where they were going. Horses panicked, drivers cursed, and pedestrians fumbled their way through a world where sight was optional, but choking was guaranteed. For children growing up in London, smog wasn't unusual, it was normal. Playing in the streets meant running through clouds of smoke and soot, returning home with hair and skin coated in grime. Respiratory problems weren't just common, they were expected. A Victorian parent might not ask, "Is my child coughing?" but rather, "How badly?" Life expectancy in cities lagged far behind rural areas, and the air quality was one of the main reasons why. The government, of course, dragged its feet. Complaints about the smog were plentiful, but action was slow. After all, coal was cheap, abundant, and profitable. Taking steps to reduce smoke meant challenging industries, homeowners, and the very fuel that kept London running. So instead of solving the problem, Victorians mostly learned to live with it. They wrapped scarves around their faces, lit extra lamps, and prayed the wind would change. Yet, as with so many Victorian crises, the smog eventually forced innovation. Public awareness grew, thanks to journalists and reformers who linked the fog to rising death rates. Doctors began tracking respiratory illnesses and connecting them to pollution. By the late 19th century, efforts were underway to improve fuel efficiency and reduce emissions, though true change wouldn't come until well into the 20th century. long after the Victorians were gone. Still, in the Victorian imagination, the fog became symbolic, a reminder of progress and its price. The Industrial Revolution had given London wealth, power, and global influence, but also skies that looked like tar and lungs that rattled like broken kettles. The same coal that built empires also built coffins. So while TV shows may still romanticize London's foggy streets, Victorian Londoners weren't swooning at the atmosphere, they were choking on it. The fog didn't just set the scene, it stole the breath of the city. And if you lived there, every inhalation was a reminder that progress came with a side of soot. If you've ever complained about your apartment being too small, just remember, in Victorian Whitechapel, small meant cramming entire families into a single room roughly the size of a modern walk-in closet. And no, there was no ensuite bathroom, unless you count the communal cesspit out back, which doubled as a playground hazard and occasionally an overflow feature when it rained too hard. Welcome to the slums, where survival was less of a lifestyle and more of a daily gamble. By the mid-19th century, London's East End, especially Whitechapel, Spitalfields and Bethnal Green, had become home to tens of thousands of the city's poorest citizens. These weren't charming Dickensian cottages with flower boxes. These were hastily built, damp, sagging tenements. Whole neighborhoods looked like they had been thrown together by someone who had read about architecture once and then decided to wing it. Houses were crammed so tightly together that streets often resembled winding corridors with little light and less fresh air. If you could stretch your arm out of your window and touch your neighbor's house, congratulations, you lived in prime Victorian real estate. The sheer density was staggering. Some courts and alleys packed more than 500 people into an area the size of a modern supermarket car park. Privacy didn't just vanish, it was never an option. When one person coughed, 20 people caught it, and when someone died, there was always someone else ready to squeeze into the spot they left behind. Inside, things didn't get better. Tenements were often single-room dwellings, where entire families and sometimes lodgers slept, cooked, ate, and tried not to murder each other in close quarters. Imagine a one-room Airbnb, except instead of a cozy listing with rustic charm, you had damp brick walls dripping with condensation, broken floorboards, and a suspicious mold patch that was evolving its own ecosystem. Ventilation was a cruel joke. Windows, when they existed, were often nailed shut to keep out the cold, or because the frame had rotted so badly it was safer to leave them sealed. The result was a stew of smells: sweat, coal smoke, rotting food, sewage wafting in from the alley, and that one guy who hadn't bathed in 3 years. You didn't just breathe the air in the slums, you marinated in it. The irony of it all, these squalid rooms weren't cheap. Landlords, many of whom never set foot in the neighborhoods they profited from, charged high rents knowing desperate tenants had no other options. Subletting was rampant. Families would rent a single room and then split it further, charging other families to share the same cramped quarters. It wasn't unusual to find 6 or 7 families squeezed into what was technically one flat. Privacy was so non-existent that even sneezes were communal events, and if you couldn't afford a room, there was the dreaded doss house, a kind of early hostel where for a penny you could get a shared bed with strangers, or for half a penny, a wooden bench to sit on overnight. The budget option was the infamous 4-penny coffin, a narrow wooden box where you could lie down fully clothed like a trial run for the real thing. Cleanliness was a fantasy. Running water didn't exist in most slum housing, so people relied on pumps and standpipes, which often stood in filthy courtyards. Waste disposal was almost non-existent, and while cesspits theoretically served as toilets, they frequently overflowed into the street. Children played barefoot in alleys coated with mud, horse manure, and whatever had just been dumped from someone's chamber pot. You've heard of street food. Well, in Victorian Whitechapel, you could find street sewage, garbage piled up because no organized collection existed for the poorest neighborhoods. Rats thrived, cockroaches thrived, diseases definitely thrived, and when everything smelled awful all the time, people stopped noticing or caring. Unsurprisingly, life expectancy in the slums was shockingly low. In Whitechapel during the 1840s, the average life expectancy was just 17 years. For comparison, someone in a wealthier district might expect to live into their 40s or 50s. Infant mortality was particularly brutal. Almost half of all children born in the East End never made it to their 5th birthday. Diseases like tuberculosis, typhus, and measles were constant threats, spreading like wildfire in the overcrowded, under-ventilated rooms. A single infected cough in a tenement could spark an epidemic, and when death came, it often did so quietly and unremarkably. Funerals were too expensive, so coffins were reused, bodies stacked in mass graves, and mourning was a luxury for people who had the time and money to dwell on loss. When you cram thousands of people into conditions this miserable, crime follows. The slums were notorious for theft, prostitution, and gang activity. Whitechapel later became infamous as the hunting ground of Jack the Ripper. But even before that, the district had a reputation for lawlessness. For many, survival required bending or outright breaking the rules. Women often turned to sex work when factory jobs weren't available, and petty theft was a daily occurrence, often just to secure food. But despite the vice, the slums were also communities. Families looked out for each other, neighbors shared scraps of food, and resilience became its own culture. In the face of unrelenting hardship, people still managed to laugh, sing, and cling to life, proving that even in the worst conditions, humanity stubbornly refuses to give up. What makes the slums especially shocking is that they thrived during a time when Britain was at the peak of its wealth and power, while the East End wallowed in filth and starvation. The mansions of Mayfair sparkled with chandeliers and hosted lavish banquets. Queen Victoria herself presided over an empire that stretched across the globe, yet millions of her subjects lived and died without clean water, sanitation, or even a private bed. The contrast wasn't just stark, it was obscene. So if you ever find yourself squeezed into a crowded subway or complaining about your noisy neighbors, just remember, at least you're not sharing your apartment with 6 other families, a colony of rats and a puddle of suspicious origin. In Victorian Whitechapel, that was just called Tuesday. If you thought the worst part about Victorian life was the smell, the fog, or the slums, let me introduce you to the headlining act of misery, disease. The Victorian era was like a never-ending subscription box of epidemics, except instead of artisan soaps and hand-roasted coffee, you got cholera, typhoid, smallpox, and tuberculosis. And the return policy? A shallow grave. Illnesses thrived in the exact conditions cities like London, Manchester, and Liverpool specialized in: overcrowding, filth, and a complete misunderstanding of how germs actually worked. It was the biological equivalent of inviting a rock band to play in your living room and then acting surprised when the furniture is destroyed. Cholera, of course, made repeat appearances, crashing through neighborhoods like an uninvited dinner guest who refuses to take the hint. It wasn't a subtle disease. One day you felt fine, the next day you were vomiting, dehydrated, and collapsing faster than a badly built Victorian tenement. The speed and violence of cholera terrified people, and newspapers of the time printed terrifying accounts of whole families struck down in a matter of hours. Unfortunately, people still believed in the miasma theory that bad air caused disease, so solutions were usually as useful as waving a lavender-scented handkerchief at a charging bull. If your plan to survive involves sniffing herbs while drinking contaminated water, let's just say you're not making it to retirement age. Typhoid, another repeat offender, spread with grim efficiency in water and food. With sanitation being practically non-existent in poorer districts, every meal was a potential gamble. A bowl of stew might fill your stomach, or it might introduce you to weeks of fever, abdominal pain, and a date with the undertaker. Families who could barely afford bread weren't exactly hiring inspectors to check if the local milk seller was diluting their product with water scooped from a ditch. Typhoid turned everyday survival into a literal game of chance, where every sip of water was a spin of the wheel. And then there was smallpox, the disease that laughed at your feeble Victorian immune system and went on to leave a trail of pockmarked survivors and corpses. Unlike cholera and typhoid, smallpox was airborne, so simply being in the same cramped, airless room as someone sick could be enough to contract it. Hospitals, when people were admitted, often looked more like warehouses of misery, with rows of patients too ill to move, and nurses doing little more than trying to comfort the dying. Vaccination had been discovered in the late 18th century, but convincing the general population to actually accept it was another story. Many Victorians distrusted the newfangled science, some convinced that vaccination would cause bizarre side effects or was a government plot. Ironically, their stubbornness only made smallpox more relentless. Tuberculosis, often called consumption, was the silent killer in the background. Unlike cholera's dramatic explosions of death, TB worked slowly, eating away at the lungs and leaving patients weak, pale, and coughing blood. It had an almost romanticized image in Victorian literature, pale women fading away, poets writing about their tragic coughs, but in reality it was horrifying, contagious, and widespread. Poor ventilation in slums made it thrive, and since treatment was basically non-existent, whole families could waste away one by one. The disease was so common it was practically an expected stage of life: childhood, awkward adolescence, coughing blood, and death. Public health boards tried to respond, but imagine sending a handful of people with notebooks and limited funding to fight a tidal wave with umbrellas. Early health boards were underfunded, underpowered, and often resented by landlords or local officials who didn't want to pay for improvements. Inspectors might declare a cellar unfit for human habitation, but without enforcement, families just stayed put, coughing and sneezing their way through another year. The government's piecemeal approach often meant action only came after crises had already exploded. Epidemics weren't just health disasters, they were political embarrassments, forcing Parliament to at least pretend they cared about the masses when the death toll became too obvious to ignore. For the average Victorian, epidemics became a grim rhythm of life. You'd read about a new outbreak in the paper, mutter a prayer, maybe sniff some camphor, and hope your family wasn't next. Doctors had little to offer beyond advice that boiled down to avoid the bad smells, and treatments ranged from bleeding to purging, because nothing says effective medicine like making a dying person even weaker. If you were wealthy, you might escape to the countryside where the air was cleaner and water safer. If you were poor, you stayed in the cities, where your survival was determined by little more than luck and stubbornness. Epidemics shaped the Victorian psyche as much as soot and smoke did. They fostered fear of the urban poor, seen as walking incubators of disease, and widened class divides, since the rich could afford escape while the poor bore the brunt. They also slowly but surely pushed governments toward reform. Each epidemic was a brutal reminder that disease didn't care whether you lived in a palace or a slum. Filth and infection could seep upward, and even the wealthy didn't want to drown in sewage or suffocate from contagion. But for decades before reform fully took hold, the cycle of epidemic after epidemic was as much a part of Victorian life as gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages. In the end, the Victorians lived in a world where every handshake, every sip of water, every crowded streetcar was potentially fatal. Epidemics weren't isolated events, they were recurring visitors, each one more devastating than the last. Living in a Victorian city meant constantly gambling with your health, and the odds were rarely in your favor. Survival wasn't about being strong or clever, it was about being absurdly lucky. If you caught something nasty in Victorian London, you might have thought, "Don't worry, the doctor will fix me up." Unfortunately, this was the medical equivalent of saying, "Don't worry, the barber will do my brain surgery." Doctors were less miracle workers and more enthusiastic guessers, armed with a bag of tricks that often did more harm than good. When infection and disease spread like wildfire, medicine was supposed to be society's firefighter. Instead, it was often the one pouring kerosene on the flames. Victorian medicine was trapped between medieval superstition and modern science. Germ theory was still a controversial idea, so most doctors didn't even think bacteria existed. They preferred theories like bad humors or imbalances in the body, which meant their treatments ranged from the bizarre to the downright dangerous. A common cure-all was bloodletting, literally draining blood from your veins to balance your body. Feeling faint? Congratulations, your doctor just made you fainter, and if you were lucky enough to survive the illness, you might not survive the cure. Then there were leeches, nature's tiny vampires that doctors stuck onto patients with the same confidence that you'd apply a band-aid. Headache, put a leech on it. Fever, leeches. Too much stress from living in an overcrowded, disease-ridden city. More leeches. In fact, leeches were so popular in the 19th century that entire swamps were drained to keep up with the demand. If you thought your doctor had a blood-sucking personality, in Victorian times it was literal. Of course, blood wasn't the only thing doctors liked to remove. Some believed purging the stomach or bowels was the best way to clean out disease. This meant strong laxatives and emetics were handed out like candy. Imagine already being weak from typhoid, only to have your doctor decide what you really needed was to vomit your soul out. The Victorians may not have understood germs, but they were world champions in dehydration. Then came the wonder drugs of the day, mercury and opium. Mercury, yes, the toxic metal, was prescribed for everything from syphilis to constipation. If your illness didn't kill you, the slow poisoning from mercury would. Opium, often mixed into a tincture called laudanum, was basically Victorian Tylenol, except addictive and mind-bending. Mothers dosed their babies with it to keep them quiet, while adults took it for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Laudanum could leave you blissfully numb to your problems, but also blissfully unaware of your approaching death. Quack doctors thrived in this environment, with official medicine being a gamble. Plenty of traveling salesmen popped up, hawking miracle cures that promised eternal health but delivered mostly alcohol, opium, or a sugar rush. Victorian streets were littered with bottles of cough syrups that could knock out a horse, tonics that promised to restore vigor, and elixirs that were 90% booze. The advertisements alone were worth the price. Imagine posters declaring, "Guaranteed to cure gout, baldness, and your mother-in-law's attitude." For many, these bottles were more entertaining than effective, but considering the alternatives, leeches, mercury, or bleeding, you might as well take your chances with snake oil. Surgeries were their own horror show. This was before antiseptics were widely adopted, so surgical theatres were basically performance halls for infections. Surgeons operated with bare hands, bloody aprons, and reused instruments wiped down with little more than a rag. Patients who survived the knife often died days later from sepsis. Anesthesia was only introduced in the mid-19th century, so before that, surgery meant being strapped down and enduring the procedure wide awake. Amputations, for example, became races against time. Surgeons prided themselves on completing them in under 2 minutes. Speed over precision, that was Victorian surgery in a nutshell. To be fair, not every doctor was a walking hazard to your health. Some forward thinkers were beginning to push for more scientific approaches. The acceptance of anesthesia and antiseptics eventually revolutionized surgery. Figures like Florence Nightingale raised the bar for hygiene in hospitals, and slowly, painfully, medicine crawled toward modernity. But for most Victorians, especially the poor who couldn't afford cutting-edge care, medical treatment remained a gamble where the odds were heavily stacked against you. So, if you got sick in Victorian London, you had a tough choice: suffer untreated, or roll the dice with a doctor who might bleed you, poison you, or give you an addiction. Either way, recovery was often less about medicine and more about sheer luck, a strong immune system, or divine intervention. In an age when germs were invisible mysteries and doctors still thought leeches had all the answers, medicine wasn't much help. It was just another hazard in a city already overflowing with them. If you ever hear someone sigh nostalgically about the good old days, remind them that in Victorian Britain, the good part rarely applied to children. The era was practically a statistical nightmare when it came to infant and child survival. Nearly 1 in every 3 children born in London in the mid-19th century died before reaching the age of 5. Imagine starting life like a contestant on a reality show where the first challenge is simply staying alive. Most didn't make it past the pilot episode. The reasons were everywhere, and they were merciless. Hygiene, or rather the glaring absence of it, was the biggest culprit. Babies were often delivered into homes where the floor doubled as a spittoon. Laundry hadn't been touched in weeks, and water for washing came straight from sources more polluted than a pub urinal at closing time. Contaminated milk was another silent killer. Without refrigeration, milk quickly spoiled, turning into a bacterial cocktail. And if that weren't bad enough, many urban families diluted milk with dirty water to stretch it further, transforming breakfast into a microbiological death trap. Today's parents fret about organic versus non-organic milk. Victorian parents were just hoping the milk wouldn't immediately send their toddler into convulsions. Then came the workplaces. Forget playgrounds, tree swings and sandboxes. Victorian children's play areas were factories and coal mines. It wasn't unusual to see 6-year-olds trudging through textile mills, inhaling cotton dust, or crawling under moving machinery to clear out clogs, a task as safe as juggling knives while blindfolded. Chimney sweeping was another cheerful career path for boys, who would wriggle up narrow flues coated with soot until their lungs were as black as the chimneys themselves. Childhood wasn't about cartoons and naps. It was about contributing to the household economy before your 10th birthday. And if the soot or factory fumes didn't get you, the crushing machinery sometimes did. Even the act of being born was risky business. Maternal mortality rates were high, and newborn care was closer to trial and error than medical science. Midwives had few sterilization practices, and hospitals, when used, were often worse, with instruments carrying the bacteria of the last 3 patients. Some babies simply didn't stand a chance. The lying-in rooms of Victorian mothers could just as well have been titled "Rolling the Dice." And when children did make it past their early years, they faced diseases that loved crowded, filthy neighborhoods. Measles, diphtheria, and scarlet fever swept through slums like wildfire, often returning in waves. Vaccinations existed for smallpox, but uptake was inconsistent, and the infrastructure to deliver them broadly wasn't robust. To make matters worse, there were strong pockets of resistance to vaccination, with parents believing it unnatural or even dangerous. Sound familiar? The irony was that, unnatural or not, smallpox didn't much care, and it happily claimed young victims by the thousands. Nutrition wasn't much of a shield either. Poor families often subsisted on bread, potatoes and weak tea, leaving children malnourished and vulnerable. Add to that the practice of sending toddlers into workhouses or baby farms, unregulated childcare facilities where infant deaths were so common they bordered on industrialized neglect. And it's no wonder the mortality numbers skyrocketed. These baby farms, run by women who took in children for a fee, were notorious for keeping the little ones alive just long enough to cash in, then letting them waste away. Statistics from the time paint a grim portrait. In some of London's poorest districts, nearly half of all children born wouldn't make it to their 5th birthday. Death notices in newspapers casually included infants' names, while families had no choice but to normalize the idea of frequent loss. Victorian parents loved their children, of course, but grief was so common it became part of the rhythm of life. Elaborate mourning customs, tiny coffins, black ribbons, photographs of dead children posed to look alive, spoke not only to sorrow but also to the sheer regularity of the tragedy. For undertakers, child-sized coffins weren't a rare order, they were the bulk of the business. The odd, almost darkly humorous outcome of all this was that those children who did survive grew up tougher than leather boots. Their immune systems had been tempered in one of the harshest environments imaginable. Surviving measles, scarlet fever, soot-filled lungs and starvation meant you'd probably live to complain about rheumatism in your old age. As the joke goes, Victorian kids weren't fragile, they were just the survivors of a brutal winnowing process. And yet, amidst the tragedy, reform movements slowly began to stir. The grim numbers couldn't be ignored forever, and social reformers, alarmed doctors, and even the occasional politician started pushing for change. Better regulation of milk, early child labor laws, public health boards, and vaccination programs all gradually chipped away at the mountain of child mortality. But that was later. For much of the Victorian period, growing up wasn't a given. It was a victory. The Victorian era loved a good disaster. Cholera was ripping through cities. Children were dying before they had the chance to earn a factory scar. and London smelled like an open latrine on a hot summer day. For a while, reform was about as popular as broccoli at a child's birthday party. But eventually, a few stubborn individuals decided that maybe, just maybe, civilization should involve not living ankle-deep in sewage. This is where the heroes, or at least the mildly competent administrators, step in. Let's start with Edwin Chadwick. If the name doesn't ring a bell, that's okay. He wasn't exactly the rock star of the 1840s. He was a lawyer turned social reformer, and his claim to fame was being obsessed with two things: cleanliness and numbers. Chadwick believed in statistics the way Victorians believed in moustache wax. He went around tallying up death rates, living conditions, and the delightful connection between overflowing cesspits and people dropping like flies. His reports were damning. They revealed that the poor weren't dying because they were lazy or immoral or cursed, all popular Victorian theories, but because they were living in environments so filthy that even rats considered them too much. His efforts pushed Parliament to pass the Public Health Act of 1848, which, in theory, was a turning point. This was the first time the government admitted it might have some responsibility in making sure entire cities weren't petri dishes. The act created local health boards to oversee sewage, waste removal, and clean water supplies. Now don't imagine sudden cleanliness and sparkling fountains. This was Victorian Britain. Progress moved slower than molasses in January. Many towns resisted, claiming sanitation was too expensive. Others argued that disease came from bad smells, the miasma theory, so all you really needed was to spritz some lavender around the outhouse. Still, the seeds of public health had been planted. Around the same time, medical reformers were pushing for vaccination. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases, a brutal killer and disfigurer. Edward Jenner had introduced his cowpox-based vaccine decades earlier, but Victorians, never ones to trust newfangled ideas, were skeptical. Some claimed vaccination was unholy, others thought it would literally turn children into cows, and many just didn't want to pay. But reformers persisted, and by the mid-19th century, smallpox vaccination programs were gaining momentum. The results spoke for themselves. Vaccination actually worked, which was more than could be said for half of the Victorian medical cabinet. Then there was the sewage problem. If you've ever wondered what finally convinced lawmakers to take sanitation seriously, the answer is both gross and hilarious. The Great Stink of 1858. On a sweltering summer, the Thames became so loaded with untreated human waste that the stench was unbearable even for people who lived surrounded by coal smoke, horse manure, and unwashed humanity. Parliament, which sat right next to the river, had to hang soaked curtains in the windows to block the odour, but it didn't help. Politicians were literally gagging during debates. Nothing spurs action like your workplace smelling like a million unflushed toilets. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer who deserves far more fame than he gets. Tasked with fixing London's sewage system, Bazalgette didn't just slap together a few drains. He designed a massive underground network of sewers that redirected waste away from the Thames. It was a feat of engineering brilliance, and it worked. Not only did it reduce the smell, it drastically cut down cholera outbreaks, proving, despite the lingering belief in miasma, that maybe germs, not smells, were the true culprits. His sewers were so well built that many are still in use today, a fact that should make modern infrastructure planners feel slightly embarrassed. Reformers also pushed for better housing. Model dwellings were built with proper ventilation, running water, and less overcrowding. Philanthropic groups like the Peabody Trust set up cleaner, safer apartments for workers. While not perfect, they were a massive improvement over the slum tenements where privacy meant only 3 families shared your bed instead of 5. Step by step, Victorians were learning that disease prevention had less to do with moral purity and more to do with not living in a human compost heap. The funny part is how revolutionary this all seemed. Cleaning up sewage, groundbreaking. Giving people fresh water, radical. Making sure milk wasn't laced with bacteria or chalk, practically witchcraft. But as reforms spread, the results were undeniable. Life expectancy rose, epidemics slowed, and cities became slightly less horrifying. For once, the Victorians stumbled into an experiment that didn't end in collective misery. Of course, progress wasn't instant. Public health reform required constant pushing against apathy, denial, and penny-pinching politicians. Yet by the late 19th century, the shift was clear. Sanitation was no longer just a luxury, it was a necessity. Reformers proved that death rates weren't inevitable, that epidemics weren't just divine punishment, and that government action could actually save lives. Imagine that. By the end of the Victorian era, one thing was clear. If you throw enough filth, disease, and death into a city, sooner or later, someone will say, maybe we should do something about this. And indeed, the Victorians did eventually. Out of the coughing, wheezing chaos of overcrowded slums, contaminated water, and questionable medical advice came the blueprint for modern public health. It wasn't a quick fix, but more like a very long and very grim apprenticeship in how not to run a city. The result, however, is a legacy we still live with today every time we drink a glass of clean water, flush a toilet, or survive childhood without a 1 in 3 chance of dying before our 5th birthday. What did we learn? First and foremost, sanitation is king. The Victorians demonstrated with grim efficiency that you cannot build a massive city, fill it with coal smoke and millions of people, and then just let sewage trickle down the street like it's some quaint medieval charm. The sewer projects of Joseph Bazalgette and the reforms of Edwin Chadwick showed that cleaner water equals fewer corpses, a fairly straightforward equation that had somehow escaped notice until cholera had wiped out half a neighborhood. Their efforts became the model for modern urban sanitation systems worldwide. Today, every time you flush, you're benefiting from a 19th century epiphany that human waste should not double as a city decoration. Another lesson: air quality matters. The infamous London fog was less charming mystery and more deadly cocktail of soot, sulfur, and despair. It took countless deaths from respiratory illness before people began to understand that industrial progress didn't need to come with a side order of black lung for every resident. Regulations slowly began to rein in the worst excesses of coal burning and factory smoke, laying the groundwork for the air pollution standards we now take for granted. Though, judging by modern cities still wrapped in smog, it seems some corners of the world didn't get the Victorian memo. We also learned the value of preventive medicine. The Victorian struggle with smallpox, tuberculosis, and cholera highlighted the desperate need for vaccination, quarantine, and eventually, germ theory. Once doctors figured out that invisible microbes, not bad air or divine punishment, were to blame for diseases, public health took a leap forward. Unfortunately, progress didn't happen without resistance. There were plenty of Victorians who fought against vaccination with as much passion as some modern skeptics fight against masks or flu shots. Apparently, the human ability to distrust science is one public health challenge that never went out of fashion. Child mortality was another sobering teacher. Victorians buried children at rates that today seem unthinkable, and it eventually forced society to invest in better maternal care, cleaner milk supplies, safer workplaces, and even basic nutrition. The idea that children deserved protection, whether from disease, labor, or contaminated food, was radical at first, but it set the stage for the child health protections we see today. Still, even now, global inequalities mean that lessons learned in Victorian Britain aren't applied everywhere. And then, of course, there's the lesson about city planning. The Victorians crammed millions into filthy slums without ventilation, clean water, or open space. The result was misery on a grand scale. But the reforms that followed, wider streets, public parks, drainage systems, showed how urban design directly impacts health. In fact, the very idea of modern urban planning owes much to the disasters of the 19th century. If you've ever enjoyed a walk in a clean, tree-lined city square, you can thank the Victorians for making life so unbearable that someone finally had to design cities with actual humans in mind. But here's the catch. While many lessons were learned, some were conveniently ignored. Industrial pollution? Still a problem. Overcrowding in poor urban areas? Check. Unequal access to healthcare? Alive and well. The Victorian age may have forced governments to recognize the link between public health and social responsibility, but the ongoing struggle to balance profit, industry and well-being is still with us. It's as if the Victorians handed us the answers in a grimly annotated textbook, and modern society decided to skip a few chapters. In the end, the Victorian public health nightmare gave rise to progress, but it also serves as a warning. Advances in sanitation, vaccination and urban planning have saved countless lives, but complacency remains dangerous. The funny angle is that the Victorians walked so modern public health could run, and occasionally trip over its own shoelaces. Because while we've built sewers, banned lead paint, and figured out that coughing into someone's face isn't ideal, the world still manages to stumble into health crises with alarming regularity. From pollution to pandemics, the Victorian ghosts are still whispering, "We told you so." Imagine a piece of jewelry so small, so unassuming that it could slip onto your finger without drawing a second glance. And yet within that tiny circle of gold or silver, a world of secrets could be hidden, sometimes deadly secrets. Welcome to the mysterious world of the poison ring, a dazzling marriage of elegance and danger. A regular ring says, "I love you." A poison ring says, "I love you," or "I might quietly end your life." Subtlety has never looked so stylish. At first glance, a poison ring might seem like an ordinary piece of jewelry. It could be a simple band of gold, a delicate silver circle, or an extravagant ring topped with a jewel sparkling like sunlight on water. But the clever thing about poison rings is that they are not what they seem. Tucked discreetly beneath a rotating bezel or a hidden compartment lies the real purpose, a small hollow space perfect for hiding tiny items. This compartment could hold a miniature note, a secret message, a medicinal powder, or for the daring or morally ambiguous user, a potent poison. Think of it as a medieval version of a Swiss Army knife, only far less convenient for opening wine bottles and far more convenient for permanent problem solving. The uses of poison rings were as varied as they were secretive. Yes, the most infamous purpose was to store poison for the occasional, let's call it accelerated persuasion of an unwelcome person. But poison rings were surprisingly versatile. Some contained scented oils to mask unpleasant odors, or to discreetly perfume one's hand before a handshake that might later decide the fate of kingdoms. Others held medicinal powders for minor ailments, allowing the wearer to self-administer remedies on the go. And of course, there were the more harmless yet equally cunning uses. Tiny messages, secret love letters, or even keys to hidden boxes. In short, the poison ring was the ultimate multi-tool of secrecy. The origins of poison rings are murky, as is often the case with objects designed to be, well, secret. Scholars trace their history back to ancient times, with examples appearing in Roman and Byzantine societies. Jewelry has always been more than mere decoration. It has been a statement of identity, wealth, and occasionally lethal intent. The poison ring represents an extreme end of this spectrum, an object that could be both a status symbol and a silent weapon. By the Renaissance period, the poison ring had become a staple among the elite, especially in Europe, where political intrigue was as common as candlelight dinners. Fashion and murder have always had a cozy relationship, and the poison ring is a shining, deadly testament to that fact. What makes the poison ring particularly fascinating and terrifying is its inconspicuous nature. Unlike a dagger hidden under a cloak or a trapdoor in a castle, the poison ring is almost laughably easy to conceal. It sits there on the finger, sparkling in sunlight, completely unassuming. A handshake, a gentle touch, or even a shared cup of wine could be enough to deliver its deadly contents. And yet, the wearer could maintain a perfectly innocent appearance. Imagine someone saying, "Oh, I just love this ring," while simultaneously contemplating your demise with the casual elegance of someone choosing a wine at dinner. It's a subtlety that is, admittedly, both horrifying and impressive. But poison rings were not purely tools of crime. They were also a testament to human ingenuity. Crafting a tiny, functional compartment in a small ring required skill, patience, and an understanding of metallurgy that would make modern jewelers proud. Artisans had to ensure the compartment was secure yet accessible, elegant yet secret. They experimented with spring-loaded mechanisms, tiny hinges, and intricate designs that allowed a completely ordinary-looking ring to conceal extraordinary secrets. In a way, every poison ring is a tiny triumph of engineering, art, and human ambition, wrapped in a glittering exterior. The allure of poison rings lies not only in their utility, but also in the stories they invite. Each ring could have its own narrative, a mystery waiting to be uncovered. Who made it? Who wore it? What secrets did it contain? In a world without instant communication or text messages, the poison ring was both a message and a warning, a silent accomplice to human intrigue, and of course, it gave the wearer a sense of dramatic flair, unmatched by even the most ostentatious diamond necklace. Because nothing says "I'm sophisticated" like casually wearing a potential murder device on your finger. So yes, poison rings are fascinating, a little terrifying, and undeniably glamorous. They blur the line between beauty and danger, between fashion and mortality. By the end of this journey, you might find yourself looking at your own jewelry differently. That delicate gold band on your finger, it may not hold a tiny vial of poison, but you'll never look at rings the same way again. Fashion and murder, a cozy, lethal duo, wrapped around your finger in the most stylish way possible. Long before the Renaissance polished poison rings into object art, the concept of a secret compartment in jewelry was already lurking in the shadows of ancient civilizations. Imagine the streets of Rome, bustling with merchants, senators, and the occasional gladius-wielding troublemaker. Among them, the well-heeled and clever might have worn a small ring that was, to the untrained eye, no different from a simple band of metal. Yet inside, it could hold a powder capable of quietly ending an argument or a life without raising a single eyebrow. Who needed a sword when you had a ring? Also, it fit perfectly in your dinner hand. In ancient Rome, poison rings weren't just fashionable. They were practical tools of survival and ambition. Political life was a minefield, where power shifted as quickly as the Tiber's currents. Senators and courtiers alike needed discreet methods of influence. Poison rings allowed them to remove rivals with unparalleled subtlety. Instead of stage managing a public duel which could easily backfire, a clever aristocrat could simply offer a drink or a handshake, letting the ring's contents do the heavy lifting. And unlike a sword, which required awkward practice and risked messy exposure, a ring could be slipped on quietly, like a secret handshake with fate itself. Over in ancient Greece, the intellectuals and philosophers were sometimes just as deadly as they were eloquent. Rings could carry powdered poisons or minute toxins derived from plants, cleverly disguised as harmless herbs or crushed minerals. Greek physicians, who were often also amateur chemists, experimented with substances like hemlock and nightshade, not just for medical purposes, but for occasional strategic removal of inconvenient rivals. It was an early form of multitasking, cultivating brains in one hand, potential murder in the other. The ancient Greeks understood two critical truths. First, that subtlety beats spectacle, and second, that a clever death is much harder to trace than a loud one. The Egyptians also embraced the secret compartment concept, though in slightly different ways. Jewelry in ancient Egypt was already steeped in symbolism and ritual. Amulets were believed to protect the wearer or invoke divine favor, but some clever nobles recognized the dual opportunity, beauty and utility. A ring could contain powdered substances for medicinal rituals, or for, shall we say, less ceremonious applications. The Egyptians had mastered both metallurgy and gem cutting, which meant rings could be intricate works of art, hiding their true purpose in plain sight. A tiny cavity beneath a lapis lazuli or carnelian stone could go unnoticed, even under the watchful eye of a pharaoh's court. In essence, it was elegance as a cover story. Behold my exquisite jewelry, and also consider this your final farewell. Materials were another aspect of ancient poison rings that showcased status, wealth, and subtle intimidation. Gold was favored for its malleability, beauty, and prestige. allowing jewelers to craft precise compartments without weakening the structure. Silver offered a cheaper but still respectable option, often adorned with inlaid gemstones that masked the ring's secret. Precious stones, such as sapphires, emeralds, and garnets, were not only decorative, they functioned as lids, concealing the hidden chambers from anyone who might glance too closely. The higher the quality of materials, the more formidable the ring, both as jewelry and as a tool of quiet, deadly diplomacy. Essentially, the ring broadcasted, "I am refined, powerful, and potentially lethal. Mind your manners." Poison rings in ancient times were not restricted to royal or elite circles, though those classes certainly popularized them. Even among the wealthy merchant class, subtle methods of decluttering competitors or disagreeable acquaintances had appeal. A merchant could quietly remove a rival without disrupting trade, maintaining appearances while quietly adjusting the balance of power in their favor. The ring allowed for discretion in societies where public violence could be socially or legally disastrous. After all, no one wanted a scandalous duel making the front page of a clay tablet newsletter. Yet, what makes these ancient rings so endlessly fascinating is how they perfectly blend human creativity with human cunning. These were small, functional objects, but each one tells a story about ambition, fear, and ingenuity. They reveal a world where survival, social climbing, and personal security could hinge on a single finger, a tiny compartment, and the clever hand that wielded it. It is a world where elegance was not just aesthetic but functional, and sometimes fatal. The craftsmanship, the secrecy, and the audacity make ancient poison rings a marvel and a warning. Humans have always loved the combination of subtlety, style, and danger. By the end of the day, whether in Rome, Greece, or Egypt, the poison ring proves one timeless lesson. In the art of survival and social maneuvering, the smallest tools can wield the deadliest power. A glance, a handshake, a discreet swirl of powder, and history quietly changes its course, and all the while the ring sparkles, utterly innocent to the untrained eye. While whispering to the initiated, elegance and murder have always shared a glass of wine together. The Renaissance, a time of art, literature, scientific breakthroughs, and murder with flair. If you thought the Renaissance was all about Da Vinci painting the Mona Lisa and Michelangelo carving David, think again. Somewhere between powdered wigs and grand feasts, Europe's elite had discovered a new accessory for the social season, the poison ring. Suddenly, elegance wasn't just about your velvet doublet or sparkling jewels. It was about the ability to dispatch a rival without leaving a trace. If you thought court gossip was deadly, imagine adding actual poison to it. From the 15th to the 17th century, poison rings reached the peak of their sophistication. They were no longer crude metal bands with a simple hollow. Jewelers experimented with tiny hinges, rotating bezels, and spring mechanisms so intricate they would make a modern watchmaker blush. Gold, platinum, and enameled surfaces were paired with rubies, sapphires, and onyx, turning a deadly weapon into a statement piece. In essence, murder had never looked so stylish. A courtier could slide a ring on their finger, lean gracefully toward a rival, and let the discreet compartment do its work, all without compromising the elegance of their lace cuffs. It was subtlety with panache. The poison ring became a favorite among royals, courtiers, and spies alike. Political intrigue was practically a spectator sport, with alliances as fragile as crystal wine glasses. Kings, queens, and ambitious nobles needed tools that could solve problems quietly. Imagine being at a royal banquet. Candles flicker, violins play softly in the background, and everyone smiles as if their lives depend on it, because, in many cases, they do. The poison ring allowed aristocrats to conduct the deadliest of negotiations without raising an eyebrow. It was diplomacy in miniature form, elegant, silent, and extremely effective. No discussion of Renaissance poison rings would be complete without mentioning some of the most infamous historical figures. The Borgia family, particularly Cesare and Lucrezia, were renowned for their flair in both politics and poison. Cesare, a man of ambition and questionable morality, reportedly had a talent for making rivals vanish quietly. Lucrezia, equally cunning, may have entertained the occasional socialite with a polite cup of wine, laced with a subtle suggestion that it was their last. Meanwhile, in France, Catherine de' Medici was a master of both statecraft and subtle murder. Known for her love of extravagant parties, Catherine allegedly employed poisoners to settle scores and maintain her power, all while hosting guests in grand halls adorned with tapestries, chandeliers, and the occasional lethal ring. Elegance, it seemed, and deadly intent were the ultimate fashion statement. But it wasn't just about royals looking chic while offing rivals. The culture of secrecy during the Renaissance was essential. A failed plot could result in public humiliation, or worse, the same fate the ring was meant to deliver to someone else. Therefore, the poison ring needed to be inconspicuous, beautiful, and mechanically reliable. Jewelers were essentially inventing tiny, portable assassination devices that doubled as high fashion. They took pride in hiding compartments beneath enameling, under gemstones, or inside rotating bezels that clicked with satisfying discretion. The wearer could perform the deadliest of tasks without anyone suspecting a thing. It was craftsmanship, cunning, and murder, all wrapped up in a glittering circle. Interestingly, poison rings during the Renaissance weren't always lethal. Some contained perfumed powders to subtly scent the wearer's hands, while others held medicinal compounds to treat headaches, digestive issues, or minor ailments. But let's be honest, the thrill of possibly killing someone with a subtle flick of the hand was undoubtedly part of the appeal. These rings were the ultimate statement of sophistication. I am cultured, fashionable, and I could remove you from existence without anyone noticing. Isn't that charming? Socially, the poison ring functioned as a secret signal among the elite. The right ring could communicate power, wit, and ruthlessness without a word being spoken. It was an intimate tool for a world obsessed with appearances. Courtiers would inspect each other's attire, searching for flaws or subtle messages, unaware that the very object they admired could be their undoing. In a society where words were measured and gestures analyzed, the poison ring allowed its wearer to operate beyond ordinary social constraints, an invisible edge in the eternal game of court politics. By the late Renaissance, these rings had become so culturally iconic that their influence extended beyond courts and palaces. They inspired literature, rumor, and legend. Tales of discreet assassinations and clever use of poison circulated widely, making the rings as famous as any king or queen. Yet despite their notoriety, the real beauty of the poison ring lay in its subtlety. The same object that could charm and delight could also remove obstacles from one's path with impeccable discretion. It was, quite literally, elegance and danger in a single golden circle. So the Renaissance poison ring was not just a tool, a piece of jewelry, or a story of intrigue. It was a symbol of the era itself, inventive, lavish, and always flirting with danger. In the hands of the ambitious, it represented ultimate control, a quiet hand at the helm of power, guiding politics and personalities with the faintest hint of menace. In short, if the Renaissance taught us anything, it's that the right accessory can change your life or end someone else's, all while sparkling brilliantly in the candlelight. If you've ever marveled at a tiny gadget that can do big things, the poison ring is its Renaissance-era ancestor. On the surface, it is an elegant ring, a golden band, a polished gemstone, or an intricate engraving. But underneath, it's a miniature mechanical marvel, a secret compartment engineered for stealth, subtlety, and sometimes outright lethality. Understanding how these rings worked is like peering into a tiny world of human ingenuity, where jewelers were part artisan, part engineer, and part mad scientist. The most obvious feature of a poison ring is its hidden compartment, often set into the bezel, the flat top of the ring where a gem might sit. The compartment was designed to be virtually invisible. Some rings had tiny sliding panels, while others had miniature lids camouflaged under gemstones or enamel. Open the right section, and you'd find a cavity no larger than a pea, yet capable of holding powder, liquid, or a small note. It was the 16th century version of a secret stash app, subtle, precise, and surprisingly effective. More sophisticated rings incorporated spring-loaded lids, which allowed the wearer to open the compartment with a discreet flick of a finger. A hidden catch could release the cover silently, giving access to the contents in mere moments. In some designs, rotating the bezel unlocked the secret, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to guess the mechanism. Every ring was custom crafted, meaning no two operated exactly the same way. Jewelers prided themselves on these ingenious mini-machines. In an age without lock-picking manuals or YouTube tutorials, creating a ring that could hide a substance and remain perfectly functional was nothing short of miraculous. Once the compartment was revealed, the ring could deliver a substance with breathtaking subtlety. The most infamous were poisons: arsenic, belladonna, cyanide, and other plant-based or mineral toxins. These powders and liquids were chosen for potency, rapid onset, or sometimes for the elegance of their effect. A faint cough, a dizzy spell, a mysterious demise. It's like a Tupperware container, but for permanent leftovers. For the ambitious, the meticulous, or the morally flexible, the poison ring offered a low-risk, high-effect method of dealing with inconvenient rivals. Unlike swords or daggers, it required minimal skill to wield, and its results were delightfully silent. Yet the practicality of the poison ring extended beyond assassination. In reality, many were used for non-lethal purposes, storing perfume, scented oils, or medicinal powders. Imagine a courtier at a party, subtly pressing a ring to release a pleasant fragrance before extending a hand for a handshake, or using powdered herbs to treat a minor headache during a long day of politics. The compartment could hold anything small and valuable, making it a multifunctional tool in a society obsessed with elegance and discretion. From a survival standpoint, this versatility was essential. The same mechanism that could kill could also soothe or delight, a rare combination of deadly efficiency and daily utility. Handling these substances required skill, patience, and a steady hand. The Renaissance-era user had to follow strict rules for storing poison safely, keeping it dry, uncontaminated, and out of the reach of curious servants or clumsy friends. A careless misstep could mean self-dosing, leading to tragic consequences for the wearer. In fact, many users treated their poison rings with the same careful attention as a jeweler might treat a rare diamond, clean, precise, and deadly when handled correctly. Avoiding accidents was paramount, because a misplaced flick or an over-enthusiastic shake could transform the elegant statement of intent into a self-inflicted catastrophe. The materials used in these mechanisms were also critical to their success. Precious metals like gold and silver provided both structural integrity and corrosion resistance, essential for preserving powders or liquids. Gemstones, besides being decorative, acted as camouflaged lids or as pressure-sensitive triggers for more advanced spring-loaded designs. Jewelers often lined the compartments with tiny layers of wax or other sealants to keep contents dry and potent. Every detail mattered. A poorly sealed compartment could render an expensive, beautiful ring utterly useless, or worse, turn it against its wearer. Interestingly, some poison rings incorporated clever safety features long before industrial regulations existed. Tiny vents or absorbent linings prevented accidental poisoning, while compartment designs minimized spillage. Users learned to test their rings discreetly, sometimes using non-toxic powders to understand the mechanics before entrusting them with a lethal substance. Renaissance society may not have had modern lab safety protocols, but the wealthiest courtiers certainly understood the importance of caution, subtlety, and secrecy. In the end, poison rings were miniature marvels of their time, small in size, yet vast in functionality. They represented a unique fusion of jewelry, mechanical engineering, and the art of subtle persuasion. Every spring, hinge, and secret compartment was a testament to human ingenuity and a reflection of the era's fascination with elegance, secrecy, and power. And whether filled with deadly powder, scented oil, or medicinal herbs, the poison ring remained an object of intrigue, admiration, and, let's be honest, a little nervous fascination. After all, who wouldn't feel a shiver of thrill at the thought that the small circle on someone's finger could change the course of a conversation or a life with a single flick? In the intricate social tapestry of the Renaissance and early modern Europe, status wasn't just about the cut of your coat, the height of your ruffs, or the sparkle of your jewels. It was also about subtlety, cunning, and the quiet display of power. Enter the poison ring, a tiny circle of metal that could convey more about its owner than any elaborate crest or coat of arms. In the hands of the wealthy, the poison ring was both a symbol and a tool, a demonstration that sophistication, wealth, and deadly wit could coexist on a single finger. Nothing screams upper class like casually plotting murder while sipping tea. For the elite, poison rings were not merely accessories, they were a way of asserting authority with discretion. Imagine a wealthy courtier settling a dispute over land, a marriage proposal, or a political alliance. Instead of public quarrels, sword fights, or noisy duels, the solution could be as simple and as subtle as a flick of a finger. A cleverly placed ring allowed one to administer consequences quietly, avoiding scandal while maintaining an appearance of civility. In this sense, poison rings were the ultimate luxury items. They combined wealth, taste, and lethal efficiency into a single, elegant package. Owning a poison ring was in itself a statement. It told peers that the wearer was not only wealthy but also intelligent and calculating. A ring could communicate to others, I have power, I have style, and I can handle my enemies without anyone ever noticing. Displaying such an object required confidence and discretion, for it was both a warning and a conversation starter, though the warning part was meant to remain unspoken. In elite circles, such subtle intimidation was a form of social currency, an invisible handshake of understanding. I am clever, careful, and perhaps a little dangerous. The contrast between the wealthy and the lower classes in terms of lethal creativity was stark. For commoners, disputes were often resolved through noisy, messy, and conspicuous means. Street brawls, pitchforks, or the occasional fistfight in the marketplace. Violence was public, immediate, and let's face it, messy. A noble with a poison ring, by contrast, could deal with problems elegantly, silently, and cleanly. The ring elevated murder, or at least the potential for it, into an art form, accessible only to those who could afford both the craftsmanship and the discretion required to wield it safely. In other words, the ring was not just jewelry, it was an upper-class problem-solving toolkit, polished to perfection. Poison rings were also deeply intertwined with political intrigue. Courtiers and rulers used them to maintain alliances, enforce loyalty, or eliminate inconvenient figures without drawing public attention. A well-placed ring could settle scores that, if handled openly, might trigger rebellion, scandal, or international embarrassment. For instance, a diplomat with the right ring could ensure that negotiations went more smoothly by reducing the number of dissenting voices silently and efficiently. These rings allowed the powerful to operate in shadows, influencing politics and society without resorting to loud displays of force. They were quiet, elegant threats that reminded everyone that survival and influence often hinged on subtlety, wit, and strategy. Ownership of a poison ring often implied membership in an exclusive social circle, where discretion and cunning were valued above brute strength. It allowed the elite to maintain control over personal and political spheres, to enforce subtle hierarchies, and to exercise authority with minimal public scrutiny. In essence, the poison ring was a badge of cleverness. The wearer didn't need to announce their power, the mere presence of the ring suggested it. It was a silent, elegant way of saying, I am not only rich, but I am capable, I am cunning, and I am always one step ahead of you. Interestingly, the poison ring also influenced social behavior. Knowing that someone might be wearing a ring capable of delivering a lethal dose of powder or liquid made people tread carefully. Conversations became measured, gestures polite, and actions deliberate. In this way, the poison ring served as a social regulator, a miniature tool of diplomacy. It didn't just empower its wearer, it imposed caution, respect, and fear in those around them. A simple piece of jewelry became a small but powerful instrument of control, subtly shaping interactions and maintaining order in a society obsessed with rank and propriety. Yet, despite its deadly implications, the poison ring maintained its reputation as a status symbol above all else. It was a reminder that elegance and danger were not mutually exclusive, that refinement and ruthlessness could cohabit in a tiny, glimmering circle of metal. It told a story about the wearer, one of wealth, sophistication, and an understanding of human nature. In the right hands, a poison ring could negotiate, intimidate, and enforce loyalty, all without a single raised voice. In the end, the poison ring's role in society extended far beyond its immediate utility. It was a marker of class, a tool of subtle power, and a testament to human ingenuity. It allowed the elite to navigate the treacherous waters of politics and social hierarchy with a quiet hand and a sparkling jewel. And while its lethal potential may have been the most thrilling aspect, the ring's true genius lay in its ability to combine wealth, elegance, cunning, and discretion in a single perfectly crafted circle. For the upper class, the poison ring was more than jewelry. It was a lifestyle. By the 18th century, the once glorious reign of the poison ring began to fade. The golden age of secret compartments and discreet assassination had collided head-on with the march of modern law enforcement, forensic science, and evolving social norms. Suddenly, the luxury of quiet, stylish murder was no longer as practical or as safe as it once seemed. A device that had once been celebrated for its ingenuity was increasingly becoming a liability. Turns out, people don't like surprise murder investigations. Who knew? Advances in chemical analysis and the rise of forensic science meant that subtle powders and liquids could no longer go entirely unnoticed. Investigators began detecting poisons that previously would have remained invisible until it was too late. A seemingly minor illness could now trigger suspicion, leading authorities directly to the person who had thought they were cleverly concealing a deadly powder in a ring. Meanwhile, the social fabric was changing. Aristocratic duels and clandestine assassinations were giving way to laws that theoretically discouraged casual poisoning. Suddenly, a ring that once allowed its wearer to operate in shadows was more likely to draw unwanted attention than admiration. The decline of poison rings was also linked to changing social attitudes. While murder as a form of problem-solving had once been discreetly admired in elite circles, by the 18th and 19th centuries, society's moral compass was shifting. No longer could a sophisticated noble rely on discretion alone. Public opinion, legal consequences, and the spread of newspapers meant that even the most carefully executed act of lethal elegance could become a scandal. A ring that whispered power and subtlety now risked screaming criminal liability. In other words, what had once been a clever status symbol was rapidly turning into a social liability. As a result, poison rings began a curious transformation. They did not disappear entirely, they simply evolved. The hidden compartments that had once held powders and vials found safer, more socially acceptable purposes. Rings became pillboxes, tiny containers for sentimental keepsakes, or miniature vessels for perfume and scented oils. The concept of secret compartments persisted, but the danger was stripped away, replaced with whimsy and practicality. A ring that once symbolized cunning and lethal elegance could now carry a pinch of lavender or a single cherished lock of hair. The deadly flair was gone, but the sense of mystery and ingenuity remained. This evolution also found its way into modern jewelry design. Today, novelty rings with hidden spaces are marketed for everything from tiny mementos to secret notes and miniature charms. The craftsmanship of past centuries lives on in these modern iterations, though the stakes are considerably lower. Instead of silently influencing political alliances or eliminating rivals, a modern wearer might tuck a sweet note into the compartment for a partner, or perhaps a miniature fortune from a playful game. Its elegance and secrecy without the lethal risk, a domestic rather than deadly use of centuries-old creativity. The history of poison rings also left a lasting legacy in literature and popular culture, inspiring countless spy stories, novels, and films. From the cloak and dagger intrigue of Renaissance courts to the subtle manipulations of fictional spies, poison rings became shorthand for clever, lethal ingenuity. Writers delighted in the combination of glamour and danger, often portraying these rings as symbols of sophistication and cunning. Their real-world history, once terrifying, now largely romanticized, provided endless inspiration for tales of intrigue, betrayal, and calculated cleverness. In many ways, the literary afterlife of the poison ring has outlived its practical use, ensuring that the object remains fascinating centuries after its decline. Interestingly, some poison rings became collectible artifacts, treasured for their craftsmanship rather than their deadliness. Museums and private collectors alike valued them as examples of ingenious design, miniature engineering marvels, and beautiful jewelry. Each ring tells a story, a history of subtle threats, political maneuvering, and the peculiar human fascination with elegance paired with danger. Even in modern times, owning a historic poison ring is less about plotting murder and more about appreciating the ingenuity and artistry of past civilizations. In the end, the decline of poison rings illustrates how tools and symbols adapt to the world around them. What was once a means of power and quiet control became a relic, transformed into sentimental keepsakes, novelty items, or museum pieces. The lethal allure may have faded, but the intrigue remains. A tiny compartment in a ring still evokes the thrill of secrecy, the cleverness of the human mind, and the undeniable charm of objects that could hide something extraordinary in the most ordinary place. From deadly devices of political strategy to modern novelties and literary icons, poison rings have demonstrated the resilience of human creativity and the evolution of cultural tastes. They remind us that an object's significance is never fixed. It changes with technology, social norms, and imagination. And while you're unlikely to be assassinated by a fashionable ring today, the legacy of the poison ring lives on in stories, collectibles, and the occasional clever jewelry box that hides a secret, proving that elegance and mystery remain an irresistible combination. Centuries after the last aristocrat quietly adjusted their cuffs and tapped a fatal powder into history, centuries may have passed since the heyday of poison rings, but these tiny, deadly marvels have never truly left the human imagination. If anything, modern media has elevated them from clandestine court accessories to iconic symbols of intrigue, sophistication, and suspense. From movies and TV shows to novels and video games, the poison ring has become shorthand for elegance, with an edge proof that humans have always been fascinated by the subtle interplay of beauty and danger. In film and television, poison rings often appear in moments of high tension, dramatic reveal, or sly humor. They're the accessory of choice for spies, schemers, and secret agents, often used to underscore a character's cunning or ruthlessness. A hero might narrowly escape a villain whose elegant hand gesture contains deadly intent, or a crafty noble may casually flick their fingers, delivering intrigue in a tiny golden circle. The ring's small size and understated appearance make it the perfect prop for suspense. The audience can see the danger, while the characters remain blissfully unaware. Even comedies have embraced the concept, using poison rings for exaggerated drama or ironic twists. It turns out the idea of quietly changing someone's fate with jewelry is both thrilling and endlessly entertaining. Literature has, of course, been equally enthralled by the poison ring. From historical novels set in Renaissance courts to modern thrillers, the object has inspired countless tales of assassination, espionage, and romantic mischief. Writers often romanticize these rings, blending history and imagination to craft narratives where a single flick of a hand can determine the rise or fall of kingdoms. The tiny hidden compartments allow for narrative tension. Secret messages, hidden poisons, or mysterious powders all become plot devices that keep readers turning pages or viewers gripping the edge of their seats. The poison ring's appeal in storytelling lies in its dual nature, a sparkling ornament that simultaneously promises beauty and danger, elegance and risk. Beyond fiction, modern fascination with poison rings has translated into collecting and recreation. Historical enthusiasts, jewelers, and fans of Renaissance history often seek out authentic antique rings, or commission reproductions crafted with meticulous attention to detail. These modern incarnations are, naturally, free from lethal intent, yet they retain the thrill of secrecy and clever engineering. Collectors delight in studying the craftsmanship, imagining how their owners centuries ago might have maneuvered through court intrigue with elegance and discretion. Now you can wear a poison ring without the inconvenience of someone actually dying. Progress. Historical reenactments and themed events have also embraced poison rings, allowing participants to explore the intersection of fashion, politics, and subtle danger. A tiny compartment can hold a discreet note, a scented powder, or a symbolic object, giving participants a taste of the Renaissance experience, minus the actual risk of assassination. These events underscore the timeless allure of the poison ring. Even centuries later, humans are captivated by the idea that a small, elegant object can harbor secrets with serious consequences. It's not just about history, it's about stepping into a world where elegance, ingenuity, and danger coexisted on a single finger. The enduring popularity of poison rings reveals something fundamental about human nature. People have always been drawn to objects that combine beauty and mystery, power and discretion. The idea that a single, unassuming ring could carry enormous potential, whether lethal, romantic, or narrative, is irresistible. Humans love the thrill of danger, even when it's safely contained in a story, a museum display, or a collectible. Poison rings embody that tension perfectly, the intersection of glamour and risk, the promise of power cloaked in elegance. In many ways, the cultural fascination with poison rings reflects a deeper truth about our attraction to storytelling, ingenuity, and the subtle dance between life and death. Whether in historical research, fiction, or cosplay, the rings capture imaginations by suggesting that danger can be refined, lethal intent can be stylish, and ingenuity can be both beautiful and fearsome. They remind us that even the smallest objects can hold vast significance, and that sometimes a well-crafted secret can be far more compelling than any overt display of strength. Ultimately, poison rings continue to captivate because they merge history, craftsmanship, and human psychology in a single elegant package. They are miniature reminders that the past was never just about swords and battles. It was about wit, subtlety, and a flair for the dramatic. And even in the modern age, their allure remains undeniable. The sparkle of a gemstone, the cleverness of a hidden compartment, the whisper of intrigue, they all combine to make the poison ring a symbol of fascination, imagination, and a touch of danger that continues to enthrall collectors, storytellers, and audiences alike. So, the next time you admire a delicate ring, consider its secret history. Somewhere beneath the gleaming surface, it might be whispering stories of intrigue, elegance, and silent power. And remember, sometimes a little sparkle really can kill. The paperclip, a tiny twisted loop of metal that lurks silently on every desk, often overlooked, yet quietly dominating office life. On its own it might seem insignificant, a small piece of bent wire, unremarkable in shape or color. And yet this humble invention has quietly shaped the world of paperwork, bureaucracy, and office survival for over a century. It's just a piece of wire until you realize it's holding your entire career together. Lose the paperclip, and suddenly that stack of reports becomes a mountain. Misplace it during tax season, and you might as well be staring into a paperless abyss. Before the paperclip as we know it existed, humans relied on less elegant methods of keeping sheets of paper together. Ancient scribes, for instance, used pins, ribbons, or even stitching to bundle scrolls and manuscripts. In medieval Europe, scribes would tie important documents with string or silk cord, carefully looping them to prevent disarray. The problem: these solutions were messy, cumbersome, and most crucially hard to undo without tearing fragile parchment. In short, paper fastening before the paperclip was a low-grade nightmare, functional but clunky and slightly terrifying for the uncoordinated. The industrial age introduced new paper technologies, printed forms, ledgers, and endless reports that required mass organization. This era demanded a practical, reusable, and simple device to hold sheets together without damage. Enter the wire. Humans discovered that a carefully bent piece of wire could hold papers together with surprising efficiency, springiness, and minimal fuss. One wire, twisted just right, could grasp multiple sheets, release them without ripping, and be used again over and over without complaint. A simple idea, but one that would quietly revolutionize offices worldwide. Patent history tells a surprisingly dramatic story for an object that seems so mundane. The gem paperclip, which would become the iconic standard we recognize today, is often credited as the design that won the office wars. Its double-looped structure was simple yet effective, a triumph of elegance and practicality. Various inventors filed patents in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, each proposing slightly different designs, some with pointed ends, some with flat loops, others experimenting with spiral or triangular forms. Yet the gem design, with its gentle curves and springy tension, proved unbeatable. It was the paperclip equivalent of a king quietly taking the throne, unnoticed yet undeniable. The story of its invention is also shrouded in a bit of mystery and myth, adding charm to the otherwise mundane object. Some sources suggest Norwegian inventor Johan Vaaler designed an early version in 1899, though his version was less practical and didn't include the double-loop design that made the gem paperclip famous. Others argue that the design evolved organically in offices across Europe, with the genius of iteration and necessity shaping what would become the universal symbol of paperwork management. Either way, the paperclip demonstrates the classic principle of invention. Necessity breeds ingenuity, even if the result is only a twisted piece of metal. The beauty of the paperclip isn't just in its function, it's in its versatility. Once introduced, the gem paperclip wasn't confined to merely holding papers. Its small, lightweight design made it portable, inexpensive and adaptable. Offices could stockpile them without significant expense. Clerks could carry them in pockets, use them on multiple projects, and most importantly, share them freely. It became, almost instantly, an unspoken hero of office life. Without fanfare, without medals, without recognition, the paperclip silently turned chaos into order. One wire, twisted with precision, quietly held back the tide of bureaucracy. Humor aside, the paperclip also reflects broader trends in human society. Its adoption mirrors the rise of industrialization, the explosion of paperwork, and the growing need for efficient organization. It's a small object, yet it enabled humans to handle increasingly complex bureaucracies. Every contract, memo, or ledger could be managed more efficiently because someone somewhere decided that bent metal was the simplest solution to a growing problem. Think about that. A tiny wire helped civilization navigate the minefield of paperwork, and for that alone it deserves its place in the pantheon of tiny, unsung inventions that quietly changed the world. In short, the paperclip is more than a piece of bent metal. It's an icon of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and understated power. It reminds us that sometimes the smallest objects can have the biggest impact. In offices around the world, from crowded cubicles to elegant boardrooms, the paperclip reigns supreme, humble, unassuming, and yet absolutely essential. And while it may never receive a statue or a headline, it quietly ensures that chaos doesn't completely overwhelm human civilization, or at least that your meeting notes don't scatter into a tragic confetti storm. So the next time you pick up a paperclip, pause for a moment, appreciate its genius, its subtle engineering, and its unmatched ability to survive decades of office life without complaint. From messy scribes of the past to modern cubicle warriors, the paperclip has endured, proving that even the smallest, simplest inventions can wield mighty power. If the last part celebrated the birth of the paperclip, this part is all about its gritty, heroic life in the trenches of daily office chaos. Offices, by definition, are places of paperwork, deadlines, and the occasional existential despair over printer jams. Within this battlefield, the paperclip emerges not as a mere tool, but as a silent, versatile warrior, quietly holding order together. At first glance, it might seem like a humble metal loop. In practice, it's the Swiss Army knife of despair, minus the corkscrew. The most obvious role of the paperclip is naturally holding papers together. It binds memos, stacks of invoices, and reports with elegant tension. allowing employees to wrestle with bureaucracy without tearing their hair out. But if you think this is its only purpose, you've clearly never spent a full week in an office. Paperclips double as bookmarks in manuals, placeholders in ledgers, and tiny clamps for receipts and post-it notes. One moment, they're clamping a client invoice. The next, they're corralling a stack of meeting notes threatening to scatter across the floor. Their subtle genius is that they perform all these tasks without complaint or fanfare. Unlike the human colleagues who inevitably forget to staple anything, creativity is where the paperclip truly shines. Offices breed improvisation, and the paperclip is the ultimate canvas for resourceful minds. When a key jams or a lock refuses to yield, paperclips transform into makeshift picks, enabling desperate clerks to retrieve filing cabinet treasures, or at least get access to the snack drawer. When electronics misbehave, a bent paperclip can reset a device, probe a small hole in a modem, or trigger a hidden switch that no one can seem to find. Paperclips also make excellent hooks for hanging ornaments, temporary cables, or impromptu signage. The desk-bound employee who carries a stash of paperclips is in essence a survivalist, armed with nothing but metal wire and ingenuity. The paperclip's versatility doesn't stop at functional improvisation. In some offices, it has become a symbol of cleverness, persistence, and understated rebellion against the tyranny of bureaucracy. It quietly tells the story of employees who refuse to be defeated by tangled receipts, jammed printers, or chaotic document piles. A paperclip represents human adaptability. The idea that no matter how convoluted the system, even the smallest tools can restore order or at least keep your memo stack intact until someone notices. It's the underdog story of the office, overlooked, underestimated, yet indispensable. Consider the variety of ways office workers have deployed paperclips in everyday problem solving. They serve as mini clamps when a folder is overstuffed, holding papers that are too many for a single binder clip. They act as makeshift tweezers when trying to retrieve a tiny screw or staple. They can even hold together a broken zipper on a briefcase in a pinch. In some extreme cases, paperclips have doubled as emergency fasteners for clothing, replacement keys for push locks, and even creatively, as tiny stands for business cards. The narrative here is clear. The office paperclip is not just a tool, it's a lifeline, flexible, cheap, and endlessly adaptable. Humor aside, this resourcefulness speaks volumes about office culture itself. In a space dominated by rules, hierarchies, and endless forms, employees often develop ingenious workarounds, with the paperclip as their constant companion. It's a symbol of quiet resistance to inefficiency, a tangible representation of the employee's mantra, where there is a wire, there is a way. And while staplers, tape dispensers, and binder clips occupy more space and draw more attention, the paperclip thrives in its simplicity, delivering utility without needing recognition. The smaller and simpler the challenge, the more the paperclip proves its worth. Interestingly, the paperclip's omnipresence fosters a kind of subtle social connection in offices. A shared stash of paperclips often signifies trust and camaraderie. Employees swap or lend them, sometimes leaving a clever bend as a signature. It's a tiny form of communication, a shared acknowledgement that in the midst of endless memos and reports, they've all survived another day with a small loop of metal. It's the quiet celebration of ingenuity. No one applauds, but everyone knows it matters. Ultimately, the paperclip's role in everyday office life is about flexibility, survival, and understated heroism. It performs mundane tasks with grace, solves tiny crises with creativity, and reminds workers that even in the most bureaucratic environments, resourcefulness matters. While managers might obsess over KPIs and deadlines, the paperclip ensures the paperwork remains physically together, sometimes, quite literally, keeping the office functioning. It is the unsung hero of cubicles, the silent guardian of files, and the understated champion of adaptability. In a world of email threads, printer jams, and towering document piles, the paperclip quietly reigns supreme. Overlooked by some, underestimated by many, it stands ready to hold, hook, bend, or rescue, performing its small, mighty duties with unwavering reliability. Without the paperclip, the office would be a far less organized, far more chaotic place, a messy battlefield where memos run wild and receipts roam free. With it, even the most hopeless stacks of paper find order, and the office warrior survives another day, armed with ingenuity and a humble loop of wire. In the theatre of office life, crises emerge with alarming frequency: a jammed filing cabinet, a computer that refuses to restart, a stack of documents teetering dangerously on the edge of the desk. These are the epic battles fought daily in fluorescent-lit arenas. And at the center of these small but intense wars stands an unsung hero, the paperclip. Tiny, unassuming, and utterly reliable, the paperclip has earned its place as the office's secret weapon, quietly saving the day when chaos threatens to overwhelm. Every office has its warriors. Some wield keyboards, others wire. Consider the humble act of repairing a crucial file. Perhaps a report is missing a staple, or the binding has come undone just as the boss enters for inspection. With a deft flick of the wrist, a paperclip transforms into a makeshift fastener, holding loose pages together just long enough to survive the meeting. It is in these moments, nothing less than heroic. The paperclip turns minor calamities, like a half-stapled memo, into dramatic high-stakes triumphs. And while the observer may barely notice, the employee knows that a tiny loop of metal has prevented what could only be described as a paper-based disaster of Shakespearean proportions. Paperclips also excel in the delicate art of unlocking drawers, cabinets, or doors. When a filing cabinet jams, and important contracts are trapped behind a stubborn lock, a paperclip bent into a makeshift pick becomes the difference between efficiency and despair. In these moments, office employees become clandestine operatives, their fingers twisting, bending, and probing, relying on nothing more than ingenuity and the humble paperclip to achieve victory. The situation is always rendered more dramatic by the proximity of a manager, the ticking clock, or the ever-looming threat of a coffee spill. In this environment, minor office crises are transformed into life-or-death scenarios. The tension is real, even if the casualties are limited to paper cuts and frayed nerves. Creativity flourishes in these heroic exploits. Paperclips are rarely confined to their original purpose of fastening paper. They morph into makeshift hairpins for hurried office workers, temporary hooks for hanging decorations or memos, or tools for untangling stubborn cords and knots. When computers refuse to cooperate, a bent paperclip can reset a device, press recessed buttons, or prod hidden switches, performing acts of technological heroism in silence. On occasion, it even doubles as a tiny weapon of distraction. Flicked across a desk, it startles a colleague, buys precious seconds, and allows a quick rescue of critical documents. Few office tools carry such versatility, and none with such understated elegance. There are countless tales of paperclips quietly saving the day in ways that would seem absurd if recounted in any other context. One office legend tells of a team struggling to present a vital project, while a storm of technical failures threatened to derail the effort. A paperclip, bent and twisted, rescued a jammed projector switch and held keynotes together just long enough to deliver the presentation. Another tale recounts a filing cabinet that refused to open minutes before an inspection. A single paperclip, maneuvered with patience and ingenuity, extracted the offending documents without leaving a trace. These are small victories, certainly, but to the office warrior, they are triumphs of epic proportions, celebrated quietly with a sigh of relief and perhaps a self-congratulatory sip of coffee. Humor plays a large role in these heroic narratives. The office is full of overblown crises, exaggerated by looming deadlines, impatient managers, and the ever-present fear of misplaced memos. The paperclip thrives in this environment, its heroics both functional and absurd. Watching a colleague wield a bent loop of wire to untangle a hopeless knot or reset a stubborn machine is akin to witnessing a miniature action scene. Tension, skill, and ingenuity condensed into a tiny metallic spectacle. It's equal parts comedy and triumph, and the paperclip emerges as both protagonist and silent observer, quietly basking in its understated glory. The paperclip's heroism is also a testament to human adaptability. In offices, employees often face a barrage of challenges for which no official solution exists. Jammed drawers, malfunctioning electronics, misplaced documents, or tangled cables. Paperclips thrive in these undefined problems, functioning as multi-purpose tools that bridge the gap between chaos and order. Their usefulness is limited only by the imagination of the employee wielding them. A bent paperclip becomes a hook, a pin, a laver, a stirrer, or a placeholder, all in a single day's work. The office that underestimates its paperclip stockpile underestimates its own capacity for ingenuity. Ultimately, the paperclip's exploits underscore an important truth. Heroism does not require grandeur. It does not demand medals, recognition, or fanfare. Sometimes it requires only a simple twist of metal, an attentive eye, and a willingness to improvise. In a world of blinking screens, towering paperwork, and chaotic office politics, the paperclip reminds us that even the smallest, simplest tools can achieve extraordinary feats. It turns ordinary employees into inventive warriors, capable of small-scale miracles in mundane settings. So the next time you witness a paperclip quietly holding a precarious stack of documents, rescuing a jammed drawer, or even untangling a hopeless cable mess, take a moment to appreciate its understated valor. In the grand theater of office life, it may be tiny, it may be unassuming, but it is indispensable. Every office has its warriors. Some wield keyboards, others wield wire, and more often than not, it is the humble paperclip that quietly ensures victory. Now let's dive into the imaginative, whimsical, and sometimes downright bizarre ways this tiny loop of metal has infiltrated popular culture. From movies to memes, cartoons to public spectacles, the paperclip has left a mark far beyond office cubicles and filing cabinets. In many ways, it has become a symbol, a tiny metallic ambassador for cleverness, minimalism, and human ingenuity. Take, for instance, the countless appearances of paperclips in films and cartoons. Animated characters often employ them for improvised solutions, unhooking a cage, fishing a key out of a drain, or constructing a makeshift tool in a pinch. In live-action films, the paperclip often becomes the ultimate MacGyver-esque instrument, a reset switch here, a lockpick there, or even a makeshift weapon in tense office espionage scenes. Its appeal is partly due to its perfectly ordinary appearance paired with extraordinary utility. It's the unassuming hero that audiences can relate to, embodying the triumph of intellect and creativity over sheer brute force. Memes, of course, have embraced the paperclip with gusto. From jokes about messy desks to exaggerated depictions of office survival, the paperclip has achieved digital immortality. Internet culture delights in highlighting how a single loop of bent metal can solve otherwise insurmountable problems. There are memes about paperclips saving critical projects, memes about losing them and descending into chaos, and even memes anthropomorphizing paperclips as tiny office warriors ready to spring into action. Humor aside, this digital fixation underscores something profound. The paperclip resonates as a symbol of resilience, the underdog triumphing against overwhelming odds, one bend at a time. Norway offers perhaps the most poetic real-life example of paperclips as more than just office tools. During World War II, Norwegian citizens wore paperclips on their lapels as symbols of resistance against Nazi occupation. At first glance, it was an innocent, mundane object, a simple loop of wire. But to those in the know, it represented defiance, solidarity, and clever non-violent resistance. This simple metal loop became a badge of courage, demonstrating that even the smallest items can carry immense cultural and emotional significance. Paperclips against tyranny. Indeed, a reminder that ingenuity often manifests in the most modest of forms. Then there's the story of the world's longest paperclip chain, a feat that might seem frivolous at first glance, but speaks to a deeper fascination with persistence and collective effort. Students, office workers, and communities around the globe have connected thousands, sometimes millions, of paperclips end to end, transforming mundane office supplies into monumental human achievements. It's a celebration of collaboration, patience, and the willingness to turn a simple object into a symbol of human tenacity. In a way, the paperclip is not just a piece of bent metal. It's a metaphor for what people can achieve when they combine small efforts into something much larger than the sum of its parts. The paperclip has also infiltrated literature, video games, and office humor as a symbol of minimalist brilliance. Writers often use it to represent clever improvisation, while games may feature it as a tool for creative problem-solving. Even in satirical works, the paperclip is used to critique bureaucracy, showing how a simple object can both expose and remedy the inefficiencies of complex systems. In essence, it represents human ingenuity in miniature, a quiet rebellion against complication, and a reminder that cleverness often lies in simplicity. Of course, humor remains central to the paperclip's pop culture persona. Its combination of ubiquity, simplicity, and versatility makes it a perfect subject for playful exaggeration. Consider the quip: when spies want to save the world, they call James Bond. When clerks want to save the day, they call a paperclip. It's absurd, yet somehow accurate. The paperclip, unassuming as it is, performs daily feats of quiet heroism that would make any cinematic spy proud. And unlike Bond, it never complains, demands a raise, or leaves fingerprints on critical documents. Cultural symbolism also extends to notions of ingenuity, persistence, and adaptability. In a world often dominated by large, complicated solutions, the paperclip reminds us that small, elegant tools can accomplish great things. Its simplicity encourages improvisation, its accessibility democratizes problem-solving, and its resilience reinforces the idea that persistence, even in the tiniest forms, can have a monumental impact. In essence, the paperclip has become a beacon of creativity, a playful emblem of human resourcefulness, and a quiet testament to the potential hidden in the simplest objects. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the paperclip's pop culture journey is how it bridges the mundane and the extraordinary. It exists simultaneously in cubicles, classrooms, and cultural memory. It connects office workers to historical resistance movements, links memes to real-world achievements, and transforms everyday problem-solving into something heroic and even poetic. In short, the paperclip is more than office hardware. It is a symbol of persistence, creativity, and understated brilliance, proving that even a tiny twisted loop of metal can capture human imagination in profound ways. So next time you pick up a paperclip, remember it is a small object with a surprisingly large cultural footprint. From animated antics to wartime defiance, from memes to monumental chains, this little loop of wire has earned its place in our collective consciousness. And if you ever find yourself doubting its might, just recall the truth. When spies save the world, it's James Bond. When clerks save the day, it's a paperclip. And sometimes that's exactly the kind of hero we need. If the paperclip is the unsung hero of the office, its superpowers come not just from versatility or heroic improvisation, but from ingenious engineering. It's easy to glance at a paperclip and see just a bent piece of wire, but the physics behind its seemingly simple design is nothing short of remarkable. Some say the paperclip is just metal. Others call it a flexible miracle of office survival, and they are not wrong. At the heart of the paperclip's magic is tension. The metal must be springy enough to bend without breaking, yet firm enough to hold multiple sheets of paper tightly together. This delicate balance allows it to exert a subtle clamping force, not so weak that papers slip out, and not so strong that it tears them. The wire's elasticity, combined with its carefully calculated looped design, ensures that it can grip a stack of sheets repeatedly without fatigue. This explains why, after decades of bending, twisting, and emergency rescues, a well-made paperclip often comes back to life as a functional loop ready to save another meeting. The bending mechanics of a paperclip are equally fascinating. Its double loop design, popularized by the gem paperclip, distributes stress evenly across the wire. This means the paperclip can stretch slightly when sliding onto papers, and then contract to maintain a secure hold. A single loop might pinch one sheet effectively, but the elegant curves of the gem design allow it to handle stacks of varying thicknesses without deforming permanently. It's a subtle combination of geometry, material science, and practical necessity, an everyday exercise in applied engineering that most office workers never consciously notice. Over the years, different shapes and types of paperclips have emerged, each designed with specific purposes in mind. There's the classic gem, the dependable workhorse that dominates office drawers worldwide. The non-skid paperclip adds tiny ridges or bumps to prevent papers from sliding, a small modification with outsized impact. Jumbo paperclips tackle thick documents that would overwhelm their smaller cousins, while designer variants introduce twists, curves, and colors purely for aesthetic pleasure. Each shape reflects a thoughtful balance between form and function, showing that even a lowly office tool can evolve into a marvel of practical design. The influence of design on creativity is another fascinating aspect. A well-crafted paperclip does more than hold papers, it inspires improvisation. The flexible wire encourages employees to bend it into makeshift tools, hooks, or even impromptu jewelry. Its simplicity makes it endlessly adaptable, inviting clever solutions to everyday problems. The office worker who carries an assortment of paperclips is not merely prepared for paperwork. They are equipped for a wide array of unplanned contingencies. The paperclip becomes a canvas for ingenuity, its form dictating function in countless unexpected ways. Modern innovations continue this tradition of subtle brilliance. Colorful plastic coatings add both visual appeal and practical benefits, such as making clips easier to spot on cluttered desks. Magnetic paperclips introduce yet another layer of utility, turning them into temporary document magnets or organizing tools for loose metal objects. Even novelty-shaped paperclips, hearts, stars, animals, combine whimsy with purpose, proving that engineering does not need to be bland to be effective. These innovations preserve the paperclip's fundamental utility while expanding its cultural and aesthetic appeal, blending practicality with creativity. The science of the paperclip also extends to material choice. Traditionally, it's made from mild steel or galvanized wire, balancing strength with pliability. Some premium variants use stainless steel for corrosion resistance, while others integrate plastic for color coding or extra grip. Even small changes in diameter or temper can alter the clip's performance dramatically. Too soft, and it bends out of shape. Too stiff, and it risks tearing papers. It's a subtle lesson in engineering. Tiny modifications can produce vastly different outcomes, a principle that resonates far beyond the office. Humor aside, understanding the physics and design of paperclips gives us a new appreciation for this tiny object. Its springiness, tension, and thoughtful curvature are not accidental. They are deliberate solutions to everyday problems. The paperclip embodies the marriage of simplicity and ingenuity, proving that even the smallest tools can achieve remarkable feats. It's a quiet triumph of design thinking, applied to a problem so mundane that few would have imagined it deserving attention. And yet, as offices around the world continue to rely on these small loops of metal, the design's brilliance is clear. It holds not only papers but also the weight of daily organization, workflow, and creativity. In conclusion, the paperclip is more than a functional loop. It is an engineering marvel disguised as a humble office supply. Its shape, material, and mechanical properties combine to create a tool that is simple, adaptable, and resilient. From tension and bending to modern innovations like plastic coatings and magnets, the paperclip proves that even the tiniest objects can embody profound engineering principles. And while most office workers might never ponder the physics behind their clips, they reap the benefits daily, enjoying a silent partner in organization, improvisation, and survival. The paperclip's genius is quiet, humble, and endlessly reliable, just like the very best inventions often are. In the vast landscape of the modern office, where towering stacks of paper, blinking screens, and relentless deadlines threaten to overwhelm, the paperclip quietly reigns supreme. It may be tiny, unassuming, and made of little more than a bent loop of metal, but its symbolic and practical power is immense. To the untrained eye, it's merely a tool, something mundane that holds sheets of paper together, but to anyone who has faced the chaos of the workplace, It is the smallest, mightiest weapon of office survival. The genius of the paperclip lies in its simplicity, paired with extraordinary utility. Unlike coffee machines, printers, or even the occasional heroic co-worker, the paperclip never complains. It does not grumble when piled high with documents. It does not take a coffee break or forget its responsibilities. And yet somehow, through sheer design and unassuming resilience, it holds everything together literally. Whether it's preventing contracts from scattering in the wind of a malfunctioning air conditioning vent, or keeping your weekly report intact as it moves from desk to desk, the paperclip quietly maintains order in a world designed to produce chaos. But the paperclip's significance extends far beyond mere functionality. It is in many ways a teacher of creativity, resourcefulness, and adaptability. It encourages employees to bend, twist, and innovate when faced with minor emergencies. Stuck filing cabinet? The paperclip becomes a makeshift lockpick. Computer refuses to reset? Bend it into a tool to reach the hidden switch. Need a placeholder, a hook, or even a tiny emergency repair? The paperclip transforms effortlessly into whatever the moment demands. Its versatility serves as a gentle reminder that even the smallest, simplest resources can have outsized impact if approached with ingenuity. The paperclip also embodies a subtle philosophy of resilience and persistence. In the office, chaos is inevitable. Printers jam, coffee spills, deadlines loom, and documents go missing. Yet the paperclip, uncomplaining and ever reliable, reminds us that survival is often about steady, incremental solutions rather than grand gestures. While humans may panic, procrastinate, or frantically search for lost staples, the paperclip patiently holds its ground. Its presence is a quiet affirmation that small, consistent actions like clamping a few sheets together can prevent catastrophe. It teaches an understated but powerful lesson. Sometimes, survival depends not on heroic leaps, but on humble loops of metal doing their work quietly and reliably. Humor, of course, is inseparable from this story. Few tools inspire both awe and amusement like the paperclip. Its inconspicuous appearance belies its true potential, leading to countless comic scenarios. The frantic employee bending wire into improvised tools, the office-wide scramble to retrieve a single missing clip, or the dramatic tension of a meeting narrowly saved by a last-minute paperclip rescue. In this sense, the paperclip is both practical and playful, a symbol of office life's inherent absurdity. It reminds workers that even in the midst of deadlines, chaos, and slightly panicked colleagues, a small object can bring unexpected order and laughter. Culturally, the paperclip has become more than a functional office tool. It is a symbol of the resilience of everyday workers. Its presence in cubicles, conference rooms, and drawers everywhere reflects human ingenuity and the ability to make the most out of limited resources. Office warriors who understand the paperclip's value know that it represents not just a tool but a mindset, the quiet determination to adapt, improvise, and survive in the face of endless bureaucratic challenges. A paperclip is a daily reminder that solutions need not be complicated to be effective, and that cleverness often hides in plain sight. Philosophically speaking, the paperclip demonstrates the power of small things in a big world. In a landscape dominated by towering spreadsheets, emails that never end, and urgent directives from on high, it is easy to overlook the tiny forces that make survival possible. Yet the paperclip proves that impact is not always proportional to size. A bend here, a loop there, a careful grasp of a few sheets. These small interventions prevent disorder from spiraling into catastrophe. It is a lesson applicable beyond the office. Sometimes, the simplest actions and smallest resources wield the greatest influence. In conclusion, the paperclip is not just a piece of metal. It is a quiet hero, a teacher, a source of ingenuity, and a tiny but mighty guardian of the office realm. It embodies persistence, creativity, and understated brilliance. It inspires laughter and awe, improvisation and ingenuity. Most importantly, it reminds us that sometimes survival and even heroism comes in small, unassuming packages. A paperclip doesn't complain, doesn't take a coffee break. and yet somehow holds everything together literally. So the next time you reach for this humble loop of wire, pause for a moment and reflect. You are holding more than papers, you are holding a symbol of ingenuity, resilience and quiet heroism. And as you slide it over your latest stack of memos or reports, remember the ultimate truth. The paperclip may be small, but it is, without question, the mightiest weapon on your desk.